Hello, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Raheel Mohammed. I'm the founder and director of Maslaha, and we're the charity that's putting on this festival, MFest, with our partners, the British Library. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping, but just to say we're so excited about this very first event. So we'll do some housekeeping and then move on to the interesting stuff. Please use the menu above to provide us with feedback on this event. Any feedback is always really useful in planning future events. You can also donate to the British Library there if you wish. You'll find social media links below this video in case you want to continue the conversation on other platforms. And you can also find out more about this event and other MFest events coming up as well. If you want to post questions, you can post questions using the form below the video. Great. So MFest. MFest is a multi-arts festival of Muslim knowledge and creativity. And we've brought together some amazing artists, thinkers, activists, community organisers to celebrate the diverse and collective power of Muslim communities. We are unapologetic, militantly so, in refusing the crude narratives that are written about us. Stories that are impoverished, but in their one-dimensional nature, also a form of brutality. So MFest, at its heart, is about being in community and writing the next chapter on our own terms. Toni Morrison writes that oppressive language does more than represent violence, it is violence. And we see so much of that in our own work, whether it's in the over-policing of Muslim and Black and Brown communities in this country, or as we're seeing right now, the oppression of Palestinians, those in Colombia and in India. And while oppression doesn't recognize borders of any form, neither do those who, in community and creativity, struggle against it. So this panel is so important and timely right now. And I'm so pleased to introduce the chair for this event as well, Aamna Mohdin. We need so many more journalists like her. She is The Guardian's first community affairs correspondent, reporting on the social, political and economic experiences of the UK's diverse communities, with a particular focus on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. She was previously a general reporter at the Guardian national news team, covering everything from homelessness to sport. Before she joined the Guardian in 2018, Aamna worked as a general assignment reporter at Quartz, an online business news site, for 4 years. She led the publication's coverage of the European refugee crisis, with notable dispatches from refugee camps in France. I hope you enjoy the event, and I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you so much. That was a really lovely introduction. And thank you for joining this event. I'm really excited to host, I'm really excited to chair this really exciting panel. So it's the panel on connecting anti-racist struggles, which will explore racism and Islamophobia here in the UK, France, the US, and globally. My name is Aamna, I'm the Guardian Community Affairs correspondent. I know quite a bit about reporting on anti-racism here, but I'm really excited that this panel is taking a more global perspective. Our brilliant panelists will speak about their involvement with anti-racist struggles in their respective countries, looking at state repression against Black and Brown communities and the resistance that's inevitably born out of it. The panel is an important opportunity, I think, to understand the differences our communities face in these 3 countries and globally, but also the similarities in the struggle for a better world. This is a very large topic and one that can definitely go on for hours, but I've restricted the discussion to 3 main themes, which is state violence, the focus on police brutality, precarious citizenship, and the struggle of the undocumented and rising surveillance. I'm really excited to introduce our 3 panelists. Our first panelist is Rokhaya. She's a French-Senegalese journalist, writer, and activist who takes actions against racism. She's been honored with Struggle Against Racism and Discrimination Award and considered one of the 100 most influential French women by Slate magazine in 2013, while Britain's Powerful Media list ranked her among the 30 most influential Black people in Europe. And then Hoda, who's a Chicago-based Iranian-American writer and abolitionist organizer and creative educator. Her political fashion work has been held from the BBC to the New York Times to the pages of Vogue and featured and cited in books, journals, and museums around the world. I should just add that the bios were really impressive, much bigger. You should definitely Google our panelists, but I'm just kind of doing a top line explanation just so we can get straight into the questions. And then, of course, we've got Zarah, a Labour MP for Coventry South. She was elected in 2019 and she grew up in the West Midlands where her grandfather had moved from Kashmir in the 1960s. So just moving on very quickly to our first section, which is state violence and police brutality. This event comes on the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd by a white police officer in Minnesota, the huge response that we saw in the US and of course globally. I'm kind of keen to tease out what these anti-racist movements looked like in each country. Rokhaya, I wanted to start first with you. There was a really big response in France. I mean, I remember being really taken back seeing the pictures in Paris. Was this protest driven by just what was happening in the US, or did you feel like it was really deeply rooted in the French experience of police brutality?
First of all, thank you for the great introduction, and thanks to Maslaha for inviting me. I'm glad and honored to be part of that conversation. As you said, I'm French and I was born and raised in Paris, and I've been involved in journalism and in anti-racism work for some time. Last year, when the world was shaken by the death of George Floyd, it appeared very quickly in France that we needed to have a public demonstration of solidarity. But the thing that activists noticed very quickly is that the coverage of what had happened in the US was very good and very clear and very accurate, actually, with a very precise depiction of the relation of power, of race relations. And what came to them was to say that when it happens in France, we don't have such a good coverage. So there is a committee which name is the Adamah Committee, which was founded in 2016 after the death of Adama Traoré in the hands of the police after an identity check. Which family founded the committee to seek justice. They were seeking for justice for 4 years, and they decided to not only protest in solidarity with George Floyd, but also force the media to observe and to cover what was going on in France. It was the opportunity to say, we know how the US have been structured by systemic racism, but systemic racism is not only something American. It also happens in France. And when it comes to France, we don't get to have such a precise depiction of race relation. So the Comité d'Adamah decided to gather people, and the response was incredible. So I think it's, in my life, I have never seen such a large demonstration against police brutality. And what was interesting is that there were many, many young people and many people who had never protested before. So there was a sense of, we need to address systemic racism in France and in the French context. And that was interesting because besides the protest, there was a major national conversation, but I think we will tell more about it a little later.
Yeah, and Hoda, like living in the US, I feel like you were in the eye of the storm, or the belly of the beast during this movement. And did you take part in those protests last summer? And how's the movement evolved in the past year?
Definitely, and thank you again also so much for having me, and MFest and Masala and everyone in the British Library for hosting this conversation. Really, really grateful to be here and learn from these amazing panelists. Yeah, I mean, for my safety, I won't talk about my own participation, but I think that I think for sure there's been a major shift in the United States after the death of the murder of George Floyd. And I think one of the major things that we saw is that calls for abolition became normalized to a certain extent. It became mainstream, this like fringe, seemingly radical demand that the police shouldn't exist was being made by nonprofits, is being made by like everyday people as they realize that police do not keep us safe. And I think a lot of this also came because it's the midst of a global pandemic when we're already realizing that all of this money that the state has is going into policing, it's going into militarism, it's going into creating bombs. Whereas people here are out of work, they have no access to healthcare, everything is being shut down and people have no safety net. And so I think that like massive disparity really made people realize that this country is invested in making bombs and making military weaponry and not actually in keeping people safe. And the police is a vestige of that. So I think this is totally for sure the entire, all credit goes to like Black women, particularly Black queer and trans folks and Black femmes who have been leading this movement for decades and decades and decades. And I think that we have to make sure that the demand is still that, it's the abolition of police and nothing short of that, that now, once the mainstream gets a hold of demands, they try to like lessen things or water things down. But I think it's very, very important that we recognize that people do want abolition. That means that they do not want the police in their neighborhoods. And I think probably one of the most exciting things that I've saw sort of change and shift in this past year has been the rebirth of a new tactic, what some call looting or rioting, but what I like to call the act of anti-violence. Not non-violence. I think non-violence is a tactic and a strategy at a particular moment in time, not like an ideal like philosophy that you just abide by. No, it's a tactic. You use it when it works and you don't use it when it doesn't work. And I think this past summer showed that the state does not respond until the state is at risk. And that means the destruction of police property. That means police cars on fire. There has been no impetus for all of these cities to be cutting funding for police budgets, having or entertaining conversations about abolition until it was white wealth and state property that was being destroyed. And I think that there are a few things, that the state loves more than white wealth and racist colonial roots. So like statues and things like that were being torn down. And what they don't care about are petitions and phone calls. That's what assistance and spam folders are. And I think that or what they're for. So I think what we saw is that we learned how to make the state move, and it's not through asking nicely. And I think it's very important that we like contextualize what we saw this past summer as not non-violence, but also it's anti-violence. Because when we're destroying, or when a police car is being destroyed metaphorically, that's removing the state's capacity to commit violence. So it's an act of removing states' abilities to commit violence against communities. That's reducing violence. That's anti-violence. And so when, for example, a Walgreens or a 7-Eleven, like a convenience store is destroyed and a homeless person gets to go eat their first meal all day, that's anti-violence, because now this person is able to come and get food when they haven't been able to otherwise. And if the state was in the business of caring for people, that person would have been sheltered in a pandemic. That person would have had food to eat. And for everybody complaining about all the rioting and looting, where were you when this person was asking for food on the street? And so I think that we're seeing a very radicalization of communities that is so, so necessary and so exciting to see that we haven't seen this level of mainstream like folding over in terms of organizers' demands until things are actually going a little bit beyond asking nicely. And I think that there's a lot that I think we can take from and we continuously learn from anti-racist struggles from around the world. But I think that there's a really important contextualization of violence in that as well too.
Zarah, we saw huge protests last summer. It was the largest anti-racist protests that we've seen in the UK in centuries. I think a Guardian analysis showed that 260 towns and cities came out in June for Black Lives Matter protests. It was really interesting and exciting to kind of report on this. Kind of moving on a year from that kind of moment, I wanted to ask you, like, how has the government responded to that call for justice, kind of specifically looking at the new policing bill that has since passed? What impact do you think it will have on brown and Black communities? And does it reflect what people are asking for on the ground?
Thanks, Aamna. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this panel. I'm a huge fan of your work, so it is so cool to be here with Hoda and Rokhaya as well. I just also want to reflect very quickly on the points that Rokhaya was making about the demonstrations in France being the biggest that we've seen in such a long time. Being involved in activist and movement politics before I entered Parliament, I've been going on demonstrations for a very long time, and I was so inspired by how young, how diverse the demonstrations for Black Lives Matter were, and how they were connecting the struggles in America with what is happening in the UK, because we know that the UK is not innocent, and the UK likes to present itself as, you know, this post-racial society, but the fact that there have been 1,741 deaths in custody or after police contact and 0 prosecution of officers tells you that the story is very different. And you asked what the government has done about this. Well, the government is very good at giving platitudes and, you know, talking about doing things and not actually doing it. In fact, they actually were very critical of BLM. There were senior Tory conservative MPs who were calling it a Marxist organization, you know, really like criminalizing language was used around the people that were protesting. And it links into the bill that we are currently kind of seeing go through Parliament, which is what I call the police crackdown bill. And the impact that that will have on Black and brown communities is huge. Because there's different aspects to it. So one of the key areas that people are talking about is how it undermines our fundamental right to protest. And we know in society, any of the rights that we have, whether it's the minimum wage, whether it's maternity leave, whether it's the weekend, all of these things have been achieved by working class people fighting for them, not something that was given, you know, out of the goodness of the hearts of the political elite. And this is what this bill essentially does. It gives the Home Secretary even more power to criminalize protest and the police as well. And what that means is that Black and brown communities, the communities that are affected by racism, communities that are affected by austerity, communities that will be affected and are affected by things like climate change, it reduces their ability to essentially hold the powerful to account and to agitate for change. And it essentially also gives the police extraordinary power in terms of stop and search. And we know the research shows that stop and search does not work. It is an ineffective tool. It racially discriminates predominantly against Black people, predominantly young Black men. And there's a stat, you're already 43 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're Black than if you're white, which is, you know, disgusting. And in terms of other parts of the legislation, you know, we have to, like Hoda was talking about, we have to contextualize all of these things. They're not happening in a vacuum. We've got anti-migrant rhetoric coming from this government. We have a Home Secretary who was talking about moving refugees to Ascension Island, which is some of the things that we see happening in Australia with Manus Island and other things. We've also got new voter ID laws, which are literally out of the Republican handbook, which will disenfranchise marginalised groups. And then we've also got constituency boundaries being redrawn. So there's a huge impact. I've touched on a little bit of it, but it is a very worrying piece of legislation. And in Parliament, but also in the streets, we will do everything that we can to make sure it does not go through.
Thank you. I wanted to also ask, how did BLM change the conversations we're now beginning to have on like historic European colonialism and some of the injustices that we're seeing today? Rokhaya, I wanted to start off first with you. How did BLM change the kind of conversation with France's relationship with its colonies, or previous colonies, I should say?
Yes, previous and current, because we have some departments which used to be colonies, so that there is something to say about that also. I think that the narrative that was prevalent before the murder of George Floyd was the fact that in the media was the fact that they were the US and we Europeans had a totally different history, and it was very difficult to make France, and I guess it's the same for other European countries, face its own past. And what people tend to forget is that the US were founded by Europeans, and the racist ideologies that were spread over the continent came from our continent. So it gave a platform for activists and for scholars to connect those history and to let the population remember how deeply, how the racist ideologies that are operating in the US now were deeply rooted in our own history, because the colonizers that that crossed the Atlantic came from our spaces. And I think that it opened a space to speak more widely about white privilege, which was not even a topic in France, and about systemic racism, which is still very difficult to speak about, because we have this idea in France that is the most common idea, that racism is something individual, that it has nothing to do with structure, with power. So we still speak about racism as one's personal mistake, but not as something that comes from the history and that is perpetrated by institutions or by any other organization. So that changed a bit. I won't say that it transformed how France was dealing with racism, but at least it put some, part of the conversation that was actually having, existing among scholars, among activists. It put that conversation in the media, even in the political landscape. But it was not that easy, because we still have that narrative saying that France is very different from the UK, from the US, because we have our own culture. We are a universalist countries, as opposed to countries that would be multicultural. But at the same time, we had to have that conversation about, the symbols of colonialism that are still, in the streets, with the statues, with the names of the streets, and the fact that we still have departments that I was mentioning before, like Martinique, Guadeloupe, or the French Guiana, which are in the Americas, that are today French, but that are suffering from the consequences of the fact that they were formerly colonies, and that most of the largest part of their populations is descent from enslaved people. So that's something that is still going on, and they're having a backlash, actually, because what's the main narrative today is that activists and scholars who are trying to point out the systemic racism in France are accused of importing American theories. Mm-hmm. So that it's very difficult to have a discourse that is anchored in France without being seen or labeled as being anti-French. And that's what we are, I would say that it's the backlash from what, the waves of protest that took place a year ago, and that now are being labeled as threatening even the French Republic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've got the same question actually, both for you, Hoda, and Zarah, but maybe Hoda, you can go first. We're seeing historic strikes and protests in Palestine and across the world against the occupation and the bombing of Gaza. I wanted to know, how did the BLM movement begin to change the conversation around Palestine? I read this article in The Guardian saying a radical change, America's new generation of pro-Palestinian voices. I'd love to know a bit more about that from you. And then Zarah, I know you've just come from the Palestine demo. Organisers think 180,000 people turn up, which would be the biggest Palestinian protest in British soil. Just wanted to have the similar question to you, but Hoda first.
Yeah, sorry, every time France is just such a funny place to every time Rokhaya is speaking, I'm just laughing in the background. I'm I cannot believe, it's so obnoxious. Yeah, and I think definitely, I think BLM and this anti-racist struggle in the United States has lent itself to a greater global awareness of how deeply connected the struggle against apartheid and ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism in Israel is, in the same ways that the United States is. And I think what's really important, I mean, for me personally, it was almost vice versa. I grew up understanding the injustices that was happening in Palestine and recognize that. And that actually allowed me to better understand the struggles around me as I was growing up, and connect that to be able to join, or before BLM, but realize the anti-racism struggles in the United States. And something that I always say is that a borderless world, this borderless world that we're all envisioning and working toward, already exists. But it exists for corporations, and it exists for capitalism, but it doesn't exist for us. And the fact that corporations like technological, like surveillance tech, the carceral state, I mean, even these ideas of like policing and anti-racism or racism, structural racism, are global. They're shared between all of these countries. The data is shared between the United States and the UK, that's collected through surveillance. And so this world already exists that we want to live in, but it's created by corporations, and we haven't even caught up to that. So I think that's always like really frustrating for me, is that like all these corporations get to live in the world that we want that doesn't exist, but we're still like living in our like nation states, like bounded by these borders. And what's really important about the connections between the United States and Palestine, I think, is that they share not only like actual tactics, and there are literally so many connections between both of these struggles, but also like temporally and as well as theoretically. So in terms of those like tangible struggles, police trainings, so much of US local police is actually trained by the Israeli occupation forces in Israel. And so it makes clear sense why, if you come to the south side of Chicago here, where it's majority working class and Black, that the police treat like Black young people on the south side of Chicago like an occupied people. And the police sees itself as an occupier's police force. And so we see all of the military training being shared between these borders. We see the military equipment being shared between these borders. We see the actual tear gas, the same canister being used in Ferguson or Chicago, as it's being currently right now used in Palestine, despite whatever ceasefire they called. And so these are like very, very direct links tangibly between the United States police force, as well as in the UK and France, before the French decide otherwise, with the Israeli occupation forces, as well as just the technology. Again, so much technology is developed in terms of surveillance in Israel, specifically in Hebron, which is one of the most heavily, densely militarized and surveilled areas in the world. That's then sold to India, that's sold to the UK, that's sold to the United States. So Palestine really does act as a testing site for Israel, in order to test weapons, test surveillance, to then sell them to other oppressing countries. But then also the logics that underpin all of this oppression. It's the war on terror. It's this idea that Muslims are inherently violent, and inherently out to get you, if you look over your shoulder, as well as racism and as well as white supremacy, and settler colonialism. I think we have to remember that Israel is founded by European colonists, just as the United States was, as Rokhaya mentioned. And that this idea of white supremacy is very much ingrained in both of the ways that this policing and militarism and surveillance exists. So these ties are both literal, but also in terms of what's underpinning them and the theories that they're pushing forward. And so I think the world is very complicated, and we shouldn't, reduce that complication. But what we shouldn't do is like actually reduce the struggle that's happening. We should never qualify resistance to European colonization. We should never qualify the existence of Israel, just like we should never qualify resistance to policing here in the United States. And I think at the end of the day, if we can really understand those structural violences and those roots within all of these oppressive systems, we can recognize how deeply interconnected they are, and therefore how interconnected all of our movements have been. And I think Afro-Palestinian and Black Palestinian struggles within Palestine are also forming very strong links with Black movements here in the United States, as well as around the world. So those connections are also just very, very historic as well too.
If you can just speak on what you saw at the demo today, and how, kind of connecting what we were seeing last summer as well.
Of course, I think it's really interesting in the UK that the people that were organizing the BLM demos, there was this there were the same people who were organizing the stuff around the climate movement, and actually we see the same people coming out for Palestine. And that's because this has been a space where people have become more politically educated about what's going on. They're able to understand what's going on as well in Palestine. And in the UK, our curriculum is so bad in so many ways. The way the media presents what's happening in the region is also very problematic in its framing of a conflict, even though we know that only one side has an army, only one side has the diplomatic support, only one side is able to get the arms that it does. And just kind of linking on to what Hoda was talking about, the complicity of our governments. There was research by The Independent that showed that British arms are being used in Palestine to kill children children and to kill families. And this is something that we see in Yemen as well, with the way we sell arms to the Saudis. And I guess our relationship, the British state's relationship with what is happening in the region, goes back to the Balfour Declaration. So there is a historic responsibility for the UK to be on the right side of justice, to make sure that, you know, the siege in Gaza, the illegal siege in Gaza ends, the occupation of the West Bank ends, that Palestinians within the state of Israel are not treated as second-class citizens affected by racist legislation. And what I saw at the demonstration was that beautiful solidarity, people from all walks of life, and there were demonstrations across the country as well, not just in London, people coming together to say, actually, we're not going to be reduced to the fact that this is an international event. We see humanity everywhere, and we're going to show up. I'm going to show solidarity with the Palestinian people and recognize that our taxes and our government is complicit in the violence that we're seeing, and they need to show some leadership on this issue. So it was really refreshing, as someone who's been involved in the Palestine solidarity movement for a very long time. And actually, I was politicized by my own trip to Palestine in 2012. It's just so inspiring to see that there is a new generation who is not taking any crap and can connect these struggles and really make sure that politicians are listening, but there's so much power in the streets.
Quickly, we can go into a bit on like precarious citizenship, and I think we'd have to speed up. We've only got about 15 minutes left before we go to all the questions, but maybe not, because we haven't had any questions yet. Rokhaya, I wondered if you could talk us about the new separatism law and the impact it could have on the Muslim community in France.
Yeah, I wanted also to speak a little bit about Palestine and the struggle that has been going on also in France for a long time. Some activists tried to protest last week, but the protest was banned by the government because it was said to be, to may trouble the public order. So people still went to protest, but there were several little protests, in different parts of Paris. It was banned in Paris, actually. There were protests in other cities. And the police force, the deployment of the police force was incredible. Like there is also such a focus and so many accusations around those kind of protests in support of the Palestinian people. And it's something that is, to me, also connected to other ways of policing, black and brown bodies in the public sphere, even if those kind of struggles are not only led by black and brown people, but they are perceived as being, the public expression of people of color. So, and I think that there is a way of policing them that is very particular. So there is this separatism law that is still in discussion between the two chambers, that was initially, actually, it was even thought about before the murder of a teacher. So we had a teacher which name was Samuel Paty, who was violently, in a very horrendous way, killed by a terrorist who claimed Islam. And because the teacher showed some of the cartoons of the Muslim prophet in his classroom. So the separatism law was already in process. But that event, that very sad event, gave the government the opportunity to just push the law and to include in that law very, how can I say that, many provisions that to me are endangering the public liberties, including the right of creating an organization, the freedom of speech. There was also, because first the bill was approved by the National Assembly, then it went to the Senate, and the Senate included provision to ban the Muslim headscarf, the hijab, in several different spaces. And it had nothing to do with the first purpose of the law, but I think that they felt so comfortable with dismantling like so many basic rights that they approved some provisions that were outrageous. And we've been debating
kill someone so much right now.
We've been debating about you know, like the how the visibility of the Muslim, and especially the Muslim women in the public sphere for decades now.
I endorse someone in,
and how can I say? I think it's like it's still in process. For example, 2 weeks ago there was a woman who decided to be a candidate for the regional elections, and she's a candidate of the majority party, the party of the president Emmanuel Macron. So she appeared on a poster to promote her group, of candidates, and then one of the heads of the far right posted a tweet and said to the one of the heads of the majority, so the party of the presidential party, is that the way you fight against separatism? And, you know, just pointing out that woman who was, you know, on the side of the president. And then instead of supporting her, the head of the party said, oh, if she remains on the poster, if she doesn't remove her headscarf, we have to remove our support to that group. And at the end of the day, the party removed their support from the group, and it was like it was just a national debate for nothing, because according to the law, she has the right to be Muslim, to wear a headscarf, and to run to any election. And we've seen how the far right could dictate its own obsessions to the majority. And it's like an ongoing debate that is still going on ever since a Muslim woman with a headscarf is appearing in the public sphere. It's a national debate over should she be in that space? Should she remove her headscarf? What does it mean? Is she supporting extremism? And it's like it's still going on, and the law will be in discussion soon in the National Assembly. And it has been denounced by many NGO supporting human rights, and I think it's a major issue.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to combine the next two sections a bit on precarious citizenship and surveillance. Mostly, I've been thinking about how do we have like Muslim citizens being allowed to be political actors in the country they are, when we've got things like the Prevent agenda, when you have immediate accusations of extremism. Zarah, can I kind of go to you first? We saw some tweets about some young kids who were protesting, being referred to Prevent. I kind of wanted to know, is this something that we should be really worried for? How Prevent once counter to the ideas that Muslims can be full citizens of this country?
So what we're seeing, especially with the Palestine demonstrations, is young people in schools taking up action, whether they're putting up posters, protesting in their campuses and their school yards, essentially, and the disciplinary kind of procedures that are taking place. And it's incredibly concerning. And there are groups that are taking on these cases. So if there are any parents or any children who have been, experiencing this at school, I strongly encourage they get in touch with those, because we're seeing this worrying trend where children will be referred to Prevent. And we know that in Prevent's training, one of the signs of radicalization, and there's many because it follows this really flawed conveyor belt theory, is that support for Palestine, criticisms of British foreign policy, becoming more Muslim are signs that this is something to be concerned about. And Prevent is something that is incredibly pervasive. It's not just affecting people in schools, it has also seeped its way into other aspects of policy, including health. So if you're someone who's experiencing mental health problems and you want to go and talk to a professional, there is this fear that actually what you're saying, the confidence that you would really assume to have with a medical professional, doesn't exist. Similarly, at university, if you're talking to someone, they now are bound by statutory duty to report that, which is incredibly concerning, because at universities, we are students, we are not suspects, and we are people who use the NHS because we need help, not because we need to be de-radicalized. So it's incredibly problematic. And one of the things that I remember when I was growing up was there was an area near where I grew up where they installed CCTV cameras, and we were told that this is for traffic calming measures and so forth. And we later found out that actually it was to spy on the local Muslim community. So you see how it actually infiltrates in all aspects of society. And you have young people who are just really the fact that they're Muslim means that the state looks at them in a particular way, that they, you know, are therefore destined to do X, Y, and Z, and it's incredibly damaging. And I think that's why in the Labour Party in particular needs to have a very strong stance when it comes to Prevent. It's not to review Prevent. We've already done the reviews. We already have the cases of how it destroys people's lives. It affects them, you know, in all aspects of life, and we need to scrap it altogether because it does not work and it is racist.
Hoda, I'm kind of aware of the surveillance of like the Black activist community and the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And I kind of wonder, is there kind of a similar arm of the state against Muslims in the US, particularly after 9/11? And do we have initiatives like Prevent that are similar to Prevent, that are curtailing, you know, progressive Muslim movements and groups?
100%. 100%. I think the United States likes to export policing tactics along with Israel and our way of incarceration. And I think we imported Prevents from the UK. So yes, 100%. We have CVE, which is Countering Violent Extremism, which operates very similarly to Prevent, also has this sort of radicalization conveyor belt, also is really focused on like training guidance counselors, also really focused on getting like lead Muslim orgs and trustable Muslim figures to sign on with like really cute community words like community engagement and all these things that like sounds cute and cuddly. But I think as Muslims, as people of color, we should know by now that we always reject federal funding, always rejecting federal funding, because it will always come with strings attached and they'll never be for your community. And I think what's also really important to note is that a lot of the surveillance programs right now in the United States that have accelerated after 9/11, as you mentioned, are rooted in anti-Blackness. And I think surveillance at large, specifically facial recognition or biotechnological surveillance within the United States, is rooted within the slave trade and rooted within the ways in which slaves in the United States were sort of dehumanized and seen as objects, and their bodies seen as and sort of like interpreted and categorized based on physical features like we would property, rather than seen for humans and deputizing, you know, white citizens to enact to like find runaway slaves and bring them back. You know, the early sort of actually where policing comes from is early slave catchers. And Simone Brown, Simone Brown, who wrote the book Dark Matters, has so much incredible information for anybody who wants to learn more about that. And so I think that we see what's really important, I think, to recognize is that surveillance against Muslims in the United States and globally is rooted in anti-Blackness, with Black Muslims, obviously, particularly sort of getting double the effect. And we see CVE particularly targeting Black Muslim refugees in Minneapolis, in Boston. And those are all the pilot cities, is where we have the biggest refugee populations from Somalia and Sudan. So it's very clear how deeply linked surveillance is to anti-Blackness, and under war on terror logics extended to Muslims, with Black Muslims sort of at both ends of that. And I think what is also important to recognize for non-Black Muslims is that when we say like we're not free until we all are all free, that's exactly what we mean. That if we just try to get rid of like quote unquote Muslim things like surveillance or CVE, then those structures on which, the structures of anti-Blackness on which that will grow are always going to come after different communities. So if we're not able to actually address those cornerstones, those very underlying logics of anti-Blackness within our communities, but also at the state level, it'll always keep regrowing its head. And so I think it's also really, really important for our communities to recognize how deeply connected, as non-Black Muslims, our liberation and our sense of freedom is connected to the Black liberation movement. And I think that right now we're seeing this expansion in so many ways. And to tie it back to this idea of like borderless and global anti-racist struggles, as I mentioned, a lot of this does come from Israel. A lot of this also is being used in Eastern Turkmenistan against Uyghur Muslims. It's being used in the occupied Kashmir by India. And it's being used here in the south side of Chicago. So again, all of this information is being shared. All of this technological advancements are actually being shared. And it's all rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-Muslim racism. And I think we're seeing a lot of expansions in ways that are really scary and have a lot of liberal guises. So we hear things like oh, COVID tracking apps so we can all be safe. But those are tracking apps. They're literally tracking your movements, and any extension of state power should be met with so much skepticism. And even in the United States, after the insurrection, when all the white supremacists like ran into the Capitol and then all the police were like, yay, welcome. And after that, Biden pledged to pour so much funding into counterterrorism in the guise of addressing white supremacy in this country. But we should know that any expansion of the state, especially in counterterrorism logics, will always end up going toward criminalizing Muslims, criminalizing Black bodies, criminalizing brown bodies. And so even in the name of white supremacist radicalization, even in the name of like COVID and health, we should always be critical of expansions of state logics of surveillance and how that will actually always inherently come back to harm communities of color.
And Rokhaya, I wanted you to have an opportunity to talk about the surveillance state in France as well, and how that impacts activist communities and progressive movements.
Thank you so much for asking the question. It's something also ongoing with a law that was also discussed lately at the end of the year 2020. There is a law which name is the Global Security Law, and there were major protests against it because it was one of its provisions was planning to ban the right to film police officers in their duty if they were filmed in a way that could mentally hurt them, which means anything. So that provision, the specific provision, was banned by the Supreme Court a couple of days ago, but the law still include some provisions that some of them have been banned, but it was planning to expand the powers of the police forces regarding video surveillance, and it could give them the access to security cameras that were around stores or in buildings. And they also had the rights to deploy drones equipped with facial recognition technology when it came to monitoring demonstrations. So it's the exact same story that makes, in order to so-called, in a way that is is pretending to protect the state, or it's just kind of expanding the powers of the state to surveil the population. And we're also dealing with the same issues with the discussion we're having now with the vaccine test and the pass that would be granted to people who would have the vaccine. And there is a strong opposition from the left parties because it tends to be a way to discriminate against, and also that pass would be also connected to the COVID app, and also, make the state able to collect data as connecting health with, how you with the place you are, where you go, and it's never a good news for minorities. So I think it's something we should really watch.
I think we're going to move on to the questions. So let me just give me a sec. The first one I wanted to pose was, how do you as individuals navigate the public space, especially when you're faced with hostility, particularly, as brown and Black women from Muslim backgrounds? It'd be really interesting. How do you guys continue to do the anti-racism work that you want, that you're really committed to, whilst kind of navigating a really volatile world, particularly one online? Should we start off with you, Hoda?
Because I'm laughing. I mean, a lot of ways, and a lot of ways, I think, for me at least, I think I'm still learning. I think we have to recognize that just being visibly Muslim, visibly people of color in this country, you're going to be faced, or really many parts of the world, you're going to be faced with some level of state violence, whether or not you're vocal or not. So I think oftentimes I see in a lot of Muslim communities that are maybe a little bit more conservative, they're like, oh, we don't want you to go out and protest because then, the government won't like you. The government already doesn't like us. okay, they were never here for us. They're not going to support us. So I think if we can recognize that we're already seen as outside of the state, we're already seen as a threat to the state, you might as well embrace that and do something that actually protects your community and like helps fight for the rights of your community and our collective liberation. So I think as someone who is Muslim, I think I'm very religious. I think for me, I'm very deeply grounded in this idea of spirituality as a Shia Muslim, particularly. I think our tradition is very much rooted in this idea of social justice and very much so in making sure that we're fighting against oppression when it's within our capacity to the extent that we can. And I think that puts upon Muslims in particular an obligation to really fight for collective liberation and recognize that it's the most important thing that we should be doing. And so when we're thinking about this like capitalist world that we live in, that is so luring to like have like a comfortable job and just make money and just like shut up and get by, well then what are we doing? You know, what is the end goal there? So I think I'm very just personally internally motivated. So I think the death threats, the harassment online is able to like really just like whiz by a little bit easily. But I also think on a very like tangible level, it's really, really important for all Muslims, whether or not you're politically active or explicitly politically active or not, we're automatically political beings, is to make sure that you have good security practices, like use encrypted messaging apps like Signal, like don't just like text your family things or anything, like just have all of your community using very good tech and health practices. And I think that's just one way to help protect yourself and your community, is to make sure that you have your right to your privacy. Even if you're not saying anything wrong, you should have a right to privacy that we just talked about is being increasingly encroached on. So making sure that you're doing what you can to protect your people in the virtual world and in person, I think is just really, really a tangibly important step that all of us should be taking.
And Rokhaya, you kind of spoke a little bit just like how othering like state actors, of the role that they're playing in othering the Muslim community, as one of the most visible like Black women in French politics and Muslim women in French politics. Yeah, I just wanted to know what it's like, and how do you kind of go on day to day, continuing the important work that you do?
Thank you for the question. It's a very important question because when you are one of the few, you become the symbol of everything. So whatever you say is considered as being, you know, as being as if you were the spokesperson of a movement, even if you're not, even if you're like myself working as a journalist or a filmmaker. And I've been like one of the few Black women on the public sphere, Black and Muslim women on the public sphere, speaking and commenting the news for now over a decade. And it's sometimes difficult because whatever you say, you know, you're under scrutiny, and whatever you say becomes you know, a new, like I can say a sentence and it's like suddenly becomes the title of 3 articles from the right, like the right-wing media. And I also, as you do, I guess, all of you get death threats or, you know, rape threats. I have pressed charges for against many people, but I also get harassment from people who would, like, for example, sue me for saying something. And it's something that is meant to discourage you, right? Because it costs much time, much money and to make you afraid of speaking out, because once you know that if you say something, you will be sued by that or this person, it makes you think twice before speaking. And I kind of get much support, which helps a lot. And I try to spend much time on self-care. I think it's important to say that you have to take care of yourself in order to be you know, efficient in your work and in your activism if you're an activist. But it's not easy, and I hope that my work will open doors to other women of color, because being the one and being like the one constantly named whenever something happens related to the topics I cover is like it's much, and I try to I really try to get some time for myself and to get the support of you know, my family and things like that. It's very important to get that.
And Zarah, the same kind of question for you, I guess, with the added stress, added joy of being a member of parliament.
Thanks, Aamna. It's hard. It's really hard when you know that there is a different standard that has been applied to you than any other member in parliament, and it's racialized, it's gendered, it's because you're Muslim, and it's because of what you're talking about. And the abuse I get really amplifies whenever I'm talking about migrants, when I'm supporting causes like BLM and Palestine. And there are times where I will cry, and I think we need to be honest about the toll that stuff does have on people. But I have an incredible support network. My staff are brilliant. They won't tell me about the death threats and so forth unless they have to, unless the police are involved. And there's social media filters that big tech we have to be really concerned about. There are filters though that we should use, so we don't have to see all the nasty stuff people are writing about us. And I think it's interesting just how complicit, I would say, a lot of the mainstream press can be in some of this as well. When I first gave my maiden speech and I was being attacked for a statement that was not problematic or controversial at all. I was talking about 40 years of neoliberalism, and I wasn't given a real right of reply. A lot of mainstream papers were talking about it, and I just had to watch it happen. And other politicians were then saying the same thing, and nothing happened. So it was very specific. And I was like, I wonder what it's about me that's different, that I get this different treatment. And I think it's just about showing solidarity when those things happen and building up those networks that you're able to defend people in our community. And I think, Hoda might correct me, but when I look at what they do in the US when Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib get attacked, I think the community comes out, those coalitions that are so beautiful within grassroots communities come out and say, we're not taking any of this crap. And I think we need to do a better job in the UK, but God willing, we'll get there.
One of the questions says, it's been an amazing year. It's been amazing to hear you all speak about the different global contexts. What tangible steps can we take to connect up and forge a more coherent global solidarity? So a very big question. And I guess, it's been such a moving 12 months, one that's been really difficult for our community, particularly those of us who have different levels of oppression. For a young anti-racist that wants to get involved, what advice do you guys have about connecting different struggles in different countries? Hoda, do you want to go first?
I went first last time.
Oh, good on you. So just to say, we've got 4 minutes left. So Rokhaya, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that what's going on this conversation, this current conversation, is very interesting and important, because we are just hearing from people from other countries and knowing what's going on in other places, documenting yourself and knowing how to use your own platform, your national platform, to amplify the voices that matter in other contexts. I think it's something that we should do, because it's we get news from the US mostly, but not as much news from country that are so close, like the UK and even like Germany, Italy, and which are facing the same kind of oppressions. So I think that being connected, trying to make some space in our own activism or in our in the place we are in, to make sure that those struggles cross the borders is something to do, according to me.
I'll go to you, Zarah. You've got a minute. What kind of advice?
I'll be very quick. To any young person who has anti-racist principles, who is going on demonstrations and is inspired, please don't leave those demonstrations and not get involved in things. Find spaces within your community. If you're at a school, set up a club, have an event, host an event. If you're working, or even if you're not working, there are that allow people who are students or retired members or not in a formal kind of working environment to join. So organizing your trade unions, join a political party. Obviously, I would say join the Labour Party and make sure that we have good policy, because everything we have to fight for, we can't be complacent in any spaces, but keep organizing, keep fighting. Democracy isn't just at the ballot box, it happens every day in every kind of interaction possible. So I would say the struggle is never over. So please don't let them stop us from fighting and winning.
And Hoda, we'll end with you. What advice could you give to young?
Definitely, aside from making sure that you're joining ongoing efforts in your communities and thinking about local power building, start working on issues with your friends that you care about. And it's not as overwhelming as you think it could be. Obviously, I think that that's really important, is to know who your targets are. And if we can actually peel back all of this like liberal and conservative BS to get to the actual root of the issues, like we're not just talking about like police reform, we're talking about police abolition, we're not just talking about reducing surveillance, we're talking about removing surveillance. If we can find those actual concrete core powers that we can actually fight on a systemic level that includes an intergenerational as well as a transnational connection, that allows these really, really strong movements. Know your power. If you're a student, you have power. If you're working in like the docks, you have so much power. We've seen so much power in organized labor just these past few weeks from South Africa to Italy, of dock workers refusing to load Israeli or unload Israeli cargo in solidarity with Palestine. So we have so much power. And I think we're taught not to recognize that. But if we really can become aware of how collectively unified and how powerful that is in order to actually push forward systemic movements for change that are transnational, I think that's so, so important.
That's such an amazing note to end on. Thank you so much to all of our three panelists and everyone for listening in what was a really amazing and interesting discussion on connecting anti-racist struggles. I just wanted to make you guys aware that this is only the first event of a really exciting festival, so make sure you guys tune in. The next event is tomorrow. It's about fantasy and world building for young adults. It's got loads of really amazing and interesting speakers. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was amazing, and every person in power should like listen to those people on that panel. They could learn something. So as Aamna said, we've got more events tomorrow. You can use the same pass. Go to mfest.org to find out more details. And our Twitter handle is @mfest UK. Thank you so much. Take care and see you at the next event.